Slasher movies are easily the biggest producer of icons in horror out of any other subgenre. Sure, you have exceptions like Jigsaw, Frankenstein, and Annabelle, but no other niche of horror films can stack up to the likes of Michael Myers, Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, or Leatherface. These movies dominated the 80s, but began to die out in the mid-90s as the basic formula became glaringly obvious to audiences, and the biggest faces in the genre started to dwindle in popularity. With Friday the 13th 9, Jason Goes to Hell being incredibly poorly received both critically and commercially compared to previous entries in the series. But as we entered into the 2010s and horror shifted to be more focused on psychological terror, it's only natural to ask the question of whether the classic format can still be entertaining to modern audiences. And if not, what changes need to be made in order to revitalize it to suit the tastes of viewers in the 2020s? My name is KopieFilms, and today we're delving deep into the topic of slashers then and now. So join me, and if you like what you see, don't be afraid to like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. Thanks. But before we get into the slashers of today, we must first take a look back at how these flicks reached their enormous heights of popularity. The origins of the slasher can be traced all the way back to 1960 with Alfred Hitchcock's iconic film Psycho. While I wouldn't necessarily class this as a slasher movie, I do think it's fair to say that this was the inspiration. A young, sexually active woman goes into a remote area for a time and ends up having to fight for her life against a crazed killer. Obviously, there's a lot more to Psycho than just that. But in that vague description, you can certainly see the bones for what would later become one of the most popular horror trends in cinematic history. Psycho was incredibly influential. I mean, obviously, it was a Hitchcock movie. And it would go on to inspire countless other spooky movies about an unknown killer. This trope became especially popular in European films such as The Girl Who Knew Too Much and A Bay of Blood, to name a couple. Now, most of these movies aren't really slashers either. They're much closer to a general murder mystery, just with a gory edge. However, there is one exception. A Bay of Blood, the film that I mentioned a few moments ago, is considered by some to be the first ever slasher flick. And I'd be lying if I said I couldn't see why, as it definitely follows part of what would later become the staple formula. A group of teens in a semi-secluded area? Check. Sexual themes? Check. Over-the-top gory kills that feel unbelievable for 1971? Check. However, I wouldn't personally tout this as the first in the subgenre for one very simple reason, that being the villain. This movie has a myriad of killers. Basically everyone in it murders someone. There's no one big bad that's terrorizing the area like there is in every other flick in this genre. I mean, Jason, Michael, Freddy, Chucky, Ghostface, Leatherface, come on. These characters are the core of each series' identity. And while this does check a lot of the boxes, it leaves the most important one blank. Although, I can confidently say that this would lay the groundwork for the actual first slasher movie released in 1978. That of course being Halloween. This film seamlessly brought together every concept we've discussed prior and built on it with its own classic villain, Michael Myers. So let's recap. This movie combined the basic concept and tension of Psycho, having a mysterious killer terrorizing a young woman, with the gore and mystery of the European films. Sprinkle on that middle-of-nowhere suburban setting of A Bay of Blood, and you've got yourself a certified hit. But writer and director John Carpenter had a little bit more up his sleeve to take this cinematic nightmare from a success to a classic. The movie opens with a POV shot, and no, not like the TikTok POV trend, an actual point of view. We're thrust into the shoes of the killer directly, geniusly setting up our monster without letting the audience get a good look at him. Tension builds as we see this threat get closer and closer to the young Judith Myers before he finally strikes and we get our first kill of the movie. But this scene isn't done yet. We're juxtaposed immediately when the killer is revealed to be a little boy. That's right, throughout this entire film, the tension builds as we only ever see what Michael was capable of as a kid. The viewer's mind runs wild as they helplessly imagine what he could do now that he's all grown up. The movie plays up this anticipation as it frames Michael to be this ever-looming threat, almost omnipotent as he stalks his prey, viewing every last action before he inevitably strikes. And that is really the heart of these movies. Michael is what makes Halloween great, plain and simple. His excellent design, physical acting, and menacing presence inspired countless other monsters to come. And that's really the part that caught on. This genre didn't become popular for the gore or the sex or the drama. It was popular because it ushered in a whole new era of monsters in the same vein as those old Universal movies. It also cemented the formula for every other slasher going forward. Beyond just the killer and shooting techniques, it was also the origin of things like the final girl trope as well. In case you're unaware, in a lot of these films, the most moral character, which was a teen girl 99% of the time, would live until the end, or in some cases be the only survivor. And this was done to reaffirm the survival rules that every movie in the genre pushed.
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie. For instance, number 1, you can never have sex.
The first of these rules would be heavily hammered home 2 years later in 1980's Friday the 13th. Yeah, I didn't realize until rewatching it recently, but every single death in this movie is preceded by nudity. That's not even an exaggeration. Like, up until the last few minutes of runtime, the movie is basically just about a group of teenagers getting it on at a camp. But regardless, this proved to be incredibly popular with audiences, leading to arguably the most common trope in slasher movies: franchising. In 1981, we had Halloween 2 and Friday the 13th Part 2. 1982, Halloween 3, Friday the 13th 3. 1984, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th 4, Children of the Corn, you get the idea. Look at the sheer amount of sequels these series spawned. This was like the superhero fatigue of the 80s. And with the excessive release of these products, people started to get exhausted. These films just became so predictable. Consequently, the biggest slasher success of the 90s was a direct parody of the movies that inspired it. The idea was to satirize the tropes of these flicks with characters who understood the rules of horror. In doing this, however, Scream, in my eyes, marked the death of classic slashers. Of course, I have nothing against the movie, but this was an admission that something needed to change in order to stay fresh. The trend was dying. From then on, these types of movies slowly faded out. Sure, the 2000s had a few hits, like Leprechaun 5, where the leprechaun goes to the hood.
The Emerald Isle to your place in the hood, and the man of green comes do no good.
But ticket sales showed that these series were no longer financially viable for the studios that produced them. From then on, horror shifted into the direction of gore and psychological terror, as shown in the Saw series, as well as, like, every A24 movie. But here we are. The genre is basically dead in the water as of 2024. Even Michael couldn't save it. So the question has to be asked, can a slasher still work today? Or is it just too tiring? Well, as all good creatives know, nothing is ever truly dead as long as you have a fresh idea. And as long as you give it time. I love you, Jason, but come on, you don't need to be on screen every single year. Yes, I am of the opinion that these can absolutely work, and even have in recent years, as studios have become more willing to give them a chance once again. However, the classics with the same basic rules are and should stay dead. The main problem is that because they have such a predictable formula, they're simply not scary. They fail at the core of what every good horror has to do. That being, terrify the audience. Their own popularity and oversaturation is ironically the biggest thing that made them boring and ended up causing their downfall. But to show how slashers can be revitalized to work for modern audiences, I want to take a look at two movies from the late 2010s that did exactly that. The first of these is the 2017 hit Happy Death Day. What this film did right is exactly what I've been hinting at throughout the entire video. It enters another new concept to keep the story interesting and unpredictable. Our main character, Tree, finds herself caught within a time loop. She relives the same day over and over again, but each time the day resets is after she's killed by a mysterious masked figure wearing a baby mask. This type of supernatural aspect has worked plenty of times in the past, like when the team behind Nightmare on Elm Street wanted to differentiate Freddy from Michael and Jason. But interestingly, Happy Death Day takes two tropes that some may see as tired, both being a slasher and a Groundhog Day type movie, and manages to combine them into something that feels new. This may seem like a simple change, but the introduction of a new concept like this really paid off, both critically and commercially, compared to slashers that had released before it in the same decade. Something else the film did that I don't think is talked about enough is leaving the audience with a message. A large part of the reason why psych horror has become so popular recently is that it doesn't leave your mind after you leave the theater. Slashers can't do this, because there's really nothing all that thought-provoking about an axe murderer trying to kill some irresponsible teens. But Happy Death Day does something that, while not necessary, greatly contributes to both its success and quality in my opinion. I mean, the movie's plot aims to answer the question of the meaning of life, as well as being used as a vessel to explore the fear of morality and critique nihilism. As basic as the messaging of this film is, it still serves to heighten the experience. Maybe I'll make a more in-depth video about it one day. Let me know if you want to see that. Okay, so Happy Death Day taught us two new rules for selling slashers to modern viewers. Number 1, add another element on top of the slasher. People know what to expect from these movies, so adding in something extra can really benefit both the tension and retention. Number 2, pay attention to your theme and messaging. It doesn't have to be anything groundbreaking, but enter into the filmmaking process with something clear that you want to say. Then use your art as a medium to express that. But, and this is very important, don't be too over the top or beat your audience over the head with it, because there will always be a group of people who just want to turn their brains off and consume this as theatrical junk food. Also, if you're way too over the top, you can isolate people who wanted the message as well, because lacking subtlety can make it seem as if you're assuming the consumer is stupid. But with that said, we've got our two rules pinned up on the board, and we can now move on to our second example, Halloween 2018. Despite what the title led many people to believe, this movie isn't actually a remake of the original Halloween from the 70s. It's actually a direct sequel, which ignores all of these films from earlier. In this one, Michael Myers is a local legend, as after the infamous Halloween night of the first movie, he was taken into custody until he reached an old age. All of the previous sequels are implied to have just been town ghost stories. And with that angle, the writers were able to undo a lot of the elements of Michael's character that ruined his scare factor. For example, in Halloween 2, it's revealed that Laurie is actually Mike's long-lost sister, and from there, the series sort of becomes about Michael just having a vendetta against his own family members. It also heavily leaned into the tropes that Scream pointed out earlier. This made Michael into an easily predictable villain and gave the audience a sense of relief because they weren't related to Michael, and therefore they had absolutely no reason to be afraid of him. So that, on top of the predictable format, led to less than stellar financial performances for the franchise. But in this new movie, they did away with all of that, as well as all of the common horror tropes. They turned Michael into this unpredictable force of nature, almost like he's some sort of predatory animal. He kills without emotion or reason, and that is exactly what reignited the fear of Michael Myers within modern audiences. And that's what brings us to rule number 3. The less people know about something, the more scared they'll be. So don't feel obligated to really explain your villain. Let the audience guess why they do what they do. It's more fun that way anyhow. With that though, this marks all 3 big changes that need to be made to revitalize slashers. Add new concepts, tell stories with purpose, and leave the details vague. Do all that, and you should have a modern classic on your hands. As an avid fan of this genre who's kinda tired of seeing the same old thing, I really hope studios begin to take notice of what some of these new movies have done right so we can see even more of them. It certainly seems like that's the case on some level though, with that Sundance slasher that just released. Judging by the trailer, it looks like they're really playing off of that force of nature idea I mentioned earlier. So again, thanks so much for watching, subscribe to help out the channel, and please remember, believe to achieve.